The rain had ceased by late afternoon, leaving the countryside glistening under a pale autumn sun. Harrowby Hall stood proudly atop the gentle slope, its tall windows reflecting the fading light. Though the mansion bore the charm of centuries past, there was something curiously unsettling about its silence. Edmund Clark, retired naval officer and widower, received the invitation a week earlier. It had come in a heavy cream envelope, the handwriting precise yet strangely cold. "Dear Mr. Clark, it would be an honor if you would join us for a private gathering at Harrowby Hall this coming Saturday. The evening shall be one of good company, fine dining, and conversation most intriguing. Yours sincerely, Beatrice Harrowby." Clark had not seen Lady Harrowby in more than 20 years. Once known for her lavish parties in London, she had withdrawn to her family's ancestral estate after her husband's death. Rumors of her reclusiveness swirled through society, but no one knew the true reason she had chosen isolation. Curiosity, more than courtesy, compelled Clark to accept. At 67, he found his days long and often lonely, the house echoing with the absence of his late wife. The thought of an evening at Harrowby Hall, with familiar faces perhaps, was appealing. When he arrived, the long drive was lined with oaks, their branches forming a tunnel of gold and crimson. The butler, a tall, gaunt man with eyes too sharp for comfort, ushered him inside without a word. The drawing room held only a handful of guests. Clark recognized Sir Anthony Wells, a rotund gentleman with a penchant for cigars, Margaret Linton, a widowed novelist known for her sharp wit, and Dr. Harold Finch, who had served as physician to half of London's aristocracy. A stranger stood apart, a younger man, perhaps in his 40s, whose dark suit and restless gaze marked him as different. Lady Harrowby entered last. Though age had lined her face, her posture remained regal. Her silver hair, swept neatly into a bun, shimmered in the chandelier's glow. She greeted them each with words of warmth, though her eyes lingered strangely long on Clark. "Tonight," she announced once they were seated at dinner, "we gather not merely to share a meal but to solve a puzzle. For within these walls lies a mystery, one that has shadowed my family for decades." Her words settled over the room like a cold mist. Forks paused midair, conversations halted. Clark felt the old thrill of suspense stir in him, as though the years had fallen away and he were again a young officer facing the unknown. Lady Harrowby continued, "Before this night is through, you shall each play a part in uncovering a truth buried too long. But beware, the past does not release its secrets without cost." And with that, the storm outside began again, as if on cue. The windows rattled, and a distant rumble of thunder seemed to echo her warning. Clark glanced around the table. Some guests appeared amused, others uneasy, but within him, a single thought burned: why me, why now? He had no answer yet. But he sensed that by dawn, Harrowby Hall would not be the same. The dinner continued in an uneasy silence, broken only by the clatter of silverware and the occasional nervous cough. Each guest seemed lost in thought, pondering Lady Harrowby's cryptic words. The storm outside had grown fiercer, as though nature itself conspired to trap them within the ancient walls of the mansion. Clark studied the others discreetly. Years of naval service had sharpened his instinct for reading men and women, and he felt certain each guest bore some hidden purpose for being here. Sir Anthony Wells attacked his roast beef with enthusiasm, though his eyes flicked nervously toward their hostess from time to time. Margaret Linton maintained her composure, sipping wine delicately, yet her sharp gaze darted around the table, observing everything. Dr. Harold Finch seemed unbothered by the drama, though Clark noticed how the physician's hands trembled ever so slightly when pouring his wine. And the stranger whose name had yet to be offered remained apart, as though the candlelight revealed more shadows than substance in his expression. At last Lady Harrowby rose, her silver gown catching the flicker of the chandelier. "My friends," she said, "you are here not merely for supper. You are here because each of you is connected directly or indirectly to the Harrowby legacy. What I am about to reveal will astonish you, perhaps even frighten you. But it is necessary." She gestured, and the butler stepped forward, bearing a small wooden box. Its surface was scratched and weathered, as though it had passed through many hands. Lady Harrowby laid it on the table. "This," she said solemnly, "is the Harrowby casket. Within it lies a confession written nearly 30 years ago by my late husband, Charles Harrowby. It concerns a crime, one that was never discovered, one that casts a long shadow over this house." A murmur spread through the guests. Margaret Linton leaned forward eagerly, the novelist in her hungry for drama. Sir Anthony wiped sweat from his brow. Dr. Finch paled visibly. Clark felt his heart quicken. He had known Charles Harrowby long ago, an arrogant man, fond of gambling, whose charm barely masked a ruthless ambition. But what crime could he have confessed? Lady Harrowby's voice trembled only slightly as she continued. "I do not know the full contents of the confession. I have never opened this casket. But I believe the truth must now come to light. Too long has this family lived under whispers and doubts. And too many of you, though you may not realize it yet, are bound to this secret." The younger man finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "Then let us open it," he said. All eyes turned to him. "And you are?" Margaret asked sharply. He gave a tight smile. "Edward Sterling, solicitor. I represent certain interests connected with the Harrowby estate. Lady Harrowby was kind enough to include me this evening." "Include you?" Sir Anthony barked. "I dare say none of us were consulted about your presence." But Lady Harrowby raised her hand, silencing him. "Mr. Sterling has as much right to be here as any of you. Perhaps more. Now, let us see what the past has hidden." The butler produced a small key, which Lady Harrowby inserted into the lock. The casket creaked open, revealing a bundle of yellowed papers tied with ribbon. The guests leaned closer as she untied it, her hands trembling. She began to read aloud. "I, Charles Harrowby, write these words with a conscience burdened. For though the world believes the tragedy of Harrowby Hall in 1899 to have been an accident, I know it was not so. The death of—" Lady Harrowby gasped suddenly, her face draining of color. She clutched her chest and swayed. The butler rushed forward, catching her before she collapsed. The paper fluttered to the table, the words incomplete. Dr. Finch sprang up. "Quickly, lay her down. She's fainted." But as Clark moved to assist, a terrible thought struck him. The look on Lady Harrowby's face had not been merely one of weakness. It had been one of shock and fear. Within minutes, Finch announced gravely, "She is gone." "Gone?" Margaret cried. "You mean dead?" The doctor nodded, his expression grim. "A sudden seizure. Perhaps her heart could not bear the strain." But Clark was not convinced. He had seen death in many forms, and something about the scene troubled him. Lady Harrowby had been frail, yes, but hardly on the verge of collapse. And the timing just as she began to reveal the contents of the confession was too convenient. Sir Anthony mopped his forehead with a handkerchief. "Good heavens! Dead, right before our eyes." Edward Sterling's eyes gleamed strangely. "Then the casket remains unread. And perhaps it should stay that way." "No," Margaret said sharply. "If Lady Harrowby wished the truth to come out, then we owe it to her memory to read it. But when they turned back to the table, the paper was gone. The bundle lay open, the ribbon untied, but the sheet with Charles Harrowby's words had vanished. "Who has taken it?" Clark demanded. The guests exchanged bewildered glances, but none confessed. The butler, pale and trembling, swore he had not touched it. A silence fell heavy as the storm outside battered the windows. Somewhere within Harrowby Hall, the truth was hiding, and one of them had just stolen it. Clark felt a chill run through him. The night had only just begun, and already death had come to Harrowby Hall. But was it natural, or murder? The storm outside raged on, a relentless drumming of rain against tall windows, as though nature itself demanded entry into the house of secrets. The once grand dining room now seemed suffocating, its ornate walls and portraits closing in on the bewildered guests. Lady Harrowby's lifeless body lay upon the sofa, a stark reminder that the night had turned from intrigue to tragedy. Clark stood by the fireplace, his mind racing. Too many details refused to sit quietly. The sudden collapse, the missing paper, the guests' shifting expressions, it all smacked of design, not chance. "Dr. Finch," Clark said, his voice calm but edged with command, "you knew Lady Harrowby well. Was there any condition, any weakness, that might explain her sudden death?" The physician cleared his throat uneasily. "Her heart was delicate, yes. She suffered fainting spells. But..." He hesitated. "Not like this. The timing just as she began to read it does seem extraordinary." "Extraordinary," Margaret Linton snapped, her voice sharp. "Call it what it is. Suspicious." Sir Anthony bristled. "Madam, surely you're not implying foul play?" Lady Harrowby was frail. The shock of her late husband's confession was enough to unseat her spirit. Margaret's eyes glittered. Or enough to provide cover for someone who did not want that confession revealed. All eyes turned toward the casket on the table, its open lid a silent witness. The ribbon dangled loosely, the pages inside rumpled. Yet the first sheet, the very one Lady Harrowby had begun to read, was gone. Edward Sterling, the solicitor, spoke at last. "We must be sensible. A woman has died. We should summon the authorities at once." The butler wrung his hands. "The telephone lines, sir, they went dead when the storm began." "Convenient," Margaret muttered. The younger man's eyes narrowed. "I don't care for your tone, Mrs. Linton. Are you suggesting I had some hand in this?" "Did you?" she shot back. "Enough." Clark's voice cut through the tension like a blade. The years of command still lingered in his tone. "Bickering will solve nothing. We are stranded here by the storm, with no means of contacting the village until morning. That gives us time to think calmly. Someone in this room has taken that confession. Perhaps the same someone who saw fit to hasten Lady Harrowby's end." A hush followed his words. The candle flames flickered, and the air seemed colder. Dr. Finch drew a shaky breath. "If we are to consider murder, then the means must be established. Lady Harrowby drank wine just before her collapse. It could have been poisoned." Clark nodded slowly. "Then we must determine who had the opportunity to tamper with it." Sir Anthony's face grew red. "This is absurd. Are we to accuse one another without proof?" Margaret's voice was calm, though her eyes burned. "That is precisely how proof is found, Sir Anthony, by examining opportunity and motive." Edward Sterling crossed his arms. "And what motive would any of us have? Lady Harrowby was an old woman with little power left in her hands." "Little power," Clark said softly. "She held the confession of Charles Harrowby, the key to some long-buried crime. If that crime implicated any one of us, the motive becomes clear. The solicitor's expression hardened, but he said nothing. They gathered in the drawing room, the storm howling beyond the tall windows. The butler lit additional lamps, though their glow seemed feeble against the encroaching dark. Lady Harrowby's body had been covered respectfully with a sheet, her presence still palpable in the silence. Clark began his quiet interrogation. "Sir Anthony, when Lady Harrowby began to read, where were your eyes?" The portly man shifted uncomfortably. "On my plate, I suppose." I scarcely recall." "You appeared nervous earlier," Clark pressed. "Why?" Sir Anthony tugged at his collar. "Because the woman always unnerved me. She had a way of looking at a man, as if she knew his sins. And yes, I played cards with her late husband in my younger days. He was a reckless gambler. I lost heavily to him. But that is no crime." "Unless the confession mentioned you," Margaret murmured. Sir Anthony glared at her but said nothing. Clark turned to the novelist. "And you, Mrs. Linton, you seemed eager to hear the confession. Why?" Her lips curved in a thin smile. "Because I thrive on truth, Captain Clark. My novels are built on the skeletons people hide. Charles Harrowby once courted me briefly, before he chose his wealthier bride. I never forgave him. Perhaps I hoped his confession would expose him as the villain I always knew him to be. Yet you insist it be read," Clark said thoughtfully. "Of course. Villains deserve the light." Next was Dr. Finch. The physician wrung his hands. "I served the Harrowby family for decades. Charles was not a healthy man, his habits were destructive. If he committed some crime, I never knew of it. My only wish was to protect Lady Harrowby in her final years." "And yet she died under your care," Margaret said cruelly. The doctor flinched as if struck. "Her heart, it was her heart. Not my doing." Finally Clark regarded Edward Sterling. The solicitor's expression was composed, but his eyes betrayed unease. "Mr. Sterling, you claim to represent interests connected to the estate. What precisely does that mean?" "I am bound by confidentiality," the man replied smoothly. "But suffice it to say, there are parties who have awaited the full settlement of the Harrowby inheritance. If this confession threatened that, well, it would complicate matters." "Complicate or destroy?" Clark asked. Sterling's lips tightened. "That depends on what the confession contained." The fire crackled in the hearth. Clark felt the old thrill of command again, the gathering of clues, the parsing of truth from falsehood. Somewhere among these people lay the answer. "We must search the house," he declared. "The missing page must be here. Whoever took it could not have gone far." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, but none objected. They searched the dining room first, moving furniture, checking beneath the heavy rugs. Nothing. The drawing room, too, yielded no clue. The butler swore he had not left the hall, his face pale as a ghost. At last, Margaret suggested they look in the library. The room smelled of dust and leather, its shelves groaning under centuries of Harrowby history. The storm outside cast eerie shadows across the tall windows. And there, upon a side table, lay the missing sheet of paper. Clark snatched it up, his heart pounding. But before he could read it aloud, Edward Sterling's hand closed over his wrist. "I think not," the solicitor said coldly. "This paper is property of the estate. It must be handled according to law." "Law?" Margaret scoffed. "You mean according to convenience." Clark's eyes met Sterling's, unflinching. "Step aside, sir. If you truly seek justice, you will not interfere." For a moment, the two men stood locked in silent battle. Then Sterling withdrew his hand, his jaw tight. Clark unfolded the paper and read aloud. "The death of Jonathan Wells in 1899 was no accident. I, Charles Harrowby, struck the blow that ended his life. He had discovered my fraud at the tables, and he threatened to expose me. I pushed him from the gallery. They called it a fall. It was murder." A collective gasp filled the room. Clark's eyes snapped to Sir Anthony, whose face had turned ashen. "Jonathan Wells," Clark murmured. "Your brother, was he not?" Sir Anthony's hand shook as he gripped the edge of the table. "Yes, my younger brother. I always believed. I was told it was an accident." His voice broke. "All these years." Margaret's gaze sharpened. "And yet, if Charles confessed, why did Lady Harrowby die before the truth could be revealed unless there was more to the confession still hidden?" Clark turned back to the casket. The bundle of papers was thick. What further sins had Charles recorded? But before he could reach for them, the lamps flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness. And in the blackness, a cry rang out. The darkness was absolute. In the sudden extinguishing of light, the great house seemed to breathe a long, low sigh that sent shivers down every spine. Somewhere in the blackness a cry rose sharp and desperate, followed by the clatter of glass breaking on stone. "Light!" Clark's voice rang out with authority. "For heaven's sake, find a lamp." The butler fumbled with matches, his trembling hands striking again and again until a tiny flame sputtered to life. He lit a lamp, its glow throwing long, wavering shadows across the library. On the floor lay Sir Anthony Wells, clutching his hand. Blood trickled between his fingers. "My God!" Margaret exclaimed. "What happened?" "A shard of glass," Sir Anthony groaned. "I stumbled in the dark, knocked over the decanter. Cut myself." Clark bent to inspect. Indeed, his palm bore a deep slice, but nothing fatal. Yet Clark's instincts told him this stumble was no accident. The timing immediately after the confession was read was too pointed. Edward Sterling's voice was cool. "Perhaps we should abandon this madness until morning. The storm has robbed us of both light and sense." "No," Clark said firmly. "The murderer moves among us. If we wait, more lives may be lost." Margaret crossed her arms. "Then we press on." What else did Charles Harrowby confess? The casket still sat on the table, the bundle of papers inside waiting like coiled serpents. Clark retrieved it and untied the ribbon with steady hands. The remaining pages revealed far more than a single crime. Charles had been ruthless. Fraud, blackmail, even theft were catalogued in his hand. But one passage in particular sent a chill through the room. "I fear my sins may one day return upon my wife. For there are those who know the truth and would not hesitate to silence her should she reveal it. Among them, Finch, who tended my health but also my secrets, Linton, who despised me for betraying her, and Sterling, whose employers profited from my deception. Even Wells, ever my companion at the table, knows more than he admits. If Beatrice ever seeks to expose me, one of them will surely strike." The words hung in the air like smoke. Every guest now stood accused. Dr. Finch staggered back, his face pale. "It's a lie. Charles was paranoid in his final years. I was his doctor, nothing more." Margaret's eyes flashed. "Convenient for you to say now." Sterling's expression hardened. And what of you, Mrs. Linton? You admit you hated him. A spurned lover, what motive is stronger? Clark raised a hand. Enough. We must consider Lady Harrowby's death tonight. She collapsed just as the confession began. If poison was the cause, it was placed in her wine. Each of you had access to the glasses. Sir Anthony shifted uncomfortably. I never touched hers. Yet you sat nearest to her, Clark said quietly. Margaret lifted her chin. And you, Captain, you, too, were close by. What absolves you from suspicion? Clark met her gaze evenly. Nothing but my conscience. Unlike the rest of you, I never profited from Charles Harrowby's sins. But I will prove which of you did. They examined the decanter. A faint residue clung to the glass, bitter to the taste. Clark's suspicion grew sharper. Doctor, what poison might act so swiftly? He asked. Finch hesitated. Digitalis, perhaps. Or strychnine. But both would leave signs. The truth can be found only by examination. Which cannot be done until morning, Sterling said smoothly. Or sooner, Clark countered. His eyes turned to the butler. Did Lady Harrowby eat or drink anything apart from the rest of us? The servant nodded nervously. She favored a particular wine. A bottle reserved for her alone. Where is it? Clark demanded. In the cellar, sir. They descended, the storm booming above as though the heavens themselves conspired against their search. The cellar smelled of damp stone and oak casks. On a shelf lay the opened bottle, half drained. Clark lifted it carefully. The label was foreign, old. He tipped a drop onto his finger, tasted it cautiously. A bitterness lingered beyond the grape. Poison, he said grimly. No doubt. Margaret whispered, then it was murder. Yes, Clark agreed. And deliberate. Someone knew she drank from this bottle alone. Someone planned her death before this evening began. Back in the library, tension mounted. The storm's fury made the windows rattle like drums. Each face bore fear and something else. Guilt. Clark studied them one by one. Sir Anthony sweating, trembling, his brother's murder newly revealed. A man of temper, but not cunning. Margaret sharp, vengeful, with motive enough but too eager for the confession to emerge. She thrived on revelation, not concealment. Dr. Finch nervous, evasive, yet bound by loyalty to the family. Too frightened to plot such a bold act or merely skilled at hiding it, and Sterling the outsider, yet strangely invested. His words had always sought to delay, to suppress the truth. His employers, unnamed, loomed like unseen phantoms. Clark turned to him suddenly. Sterling. It was you. The solicitor stiffened. Nonsense. On what grounds do you accuse me? On the grounds of foresight, Clark said. You alone knew the casket's contents could imperil your clients. You alone urged silence at every turn. You alone had access to Lady Harrowby's private wine through the butler. The servant gasped. Sir, I only fetched what Mr. Sterling instructed. He said Lady Harrowby preferred it. All eyes swung to the solicitor. Sterling's composure cracked. You fools. Do you think the Harrowby fortune should fall into ruin because of one old woman's guilty conscience? My employers would see it preserved. I did what was necessary. You poisoned her, Clark said coldly. Sterling's eyes flashed. She was going to ruin everything. I couldn't allow it. And you meddling old man, you've ruined it now. With sudden violence, Sterling lunged for the fire poker. The guests screamed. Clark, though past his prime, moved with the reflexes of a man who had faced danger before. He seized Sterling's arm, the two struggling fiercely. The poker clattered to the ground. Sterling twisted free, bolting for the door. But the storm had turned the steps slick, and as he fled into the night, a flash of lightning revealed his form slipping, tumbling down the stone stair. By the time they reached him, the solicitor lay broken on the ground, the storm washing over him. His last breath escaped in a ragged whisper, "The estate must endure." And then he was gone. Morning came grey and cold. The storm had passed, leaving Harrowby Hall in uneasy silence. The authorities arrived at last, summoned by the butler at first light. Clark gave his account plainly, producing the confession as proof. The police took notes, their faces grave. Lady Harrowby's death was ruled murder by poison, Edward Sterling, dead in his flight, the guilty party. Yet the confession of Charles Harrowby remained a damning chronicle of sins that would stain the family name forever. Sir Anthony wept openly for his brother, the years of ignorance crashing down upon him. Margaret vowed to write no novel of the affair, for truth itself had become too bitter. Dr. Finch retreated into silence, his loyalty broken by revelation. As for Clark, he stood upon the steps of the old hall, gazing across the drenched countryside. The house loomed behind him, its windows dark, its secrets laid bare at last. He drew his coat tighter. Age weighed upon him, but so too did the fire of purpose. For a man who had lost much, the night had returned something precious, the sense that life, even in its twilight, still held mysteries worth confronting. He walked down the drive as the sun broke weakly through the clouds. Harrowby Hall faded into the mist, a monument to greed, guilt, and justice delivered too late. But in Clark's heart there remained a quiet certainty that the truth, once uncovered, was worth any storm.